All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to session number 2 of our discussion of Hayden White's Tropics of Discourse. I am joined by my friend, OG Rose, also known as Daniel Garner.
Yeah, we go by multiple names. It's like a dialectic in the mind. It keeps you agile or different things. So, it's a combination of my wife and I's pen name. It's so great to be here, Davood. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. It's great to have you.
Absolutely.
You're co-hosting this session. And John David, the other co-host, the absent co-host for this session, couldn't be with us. And we might start the next session discussing some leftover items.
Well, I certainly enjoyed your talk. I certainly enjoyed your talk with him on the last session. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost like he wants to describe, I just had this image of discourses as landscapes, topographies, I suppose, that you crawl in. Every time you enter into a discourse, you enter it into an entire kind of landscape. It's almost like when I say, oh, we're going to go visit Charlottesville, or I live in Virginia, so I'm naming, Bedford, that's the whole town, right? So likewise, you say, oh, let's talk about justice, or let's talk about government. There's actually an entire landscape that you have to take into consideration, as opposed to just the subject. You're almost tempted to think it's just the subject, and you lose sight of all the other landscapes. And that's how I took that introduction. And it seems like he's doing something similar here on historical studies. Almost is kind of how I took it. What did he? Does that ring a bell? Am I close on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you regarding the discourse as a landscape. I would also add. What I would add to that is landscape plus all our instruments of observation that might magnify, distort, color our perception of the landscape, in addition to our perspective, our relative position to what we're observing. So all those things, I think the metaphors, the tropes that he's pointing out, they are parts of our access to the landscape.
Yeah, I'm terrible at interrupting. So, it's the difference between, say, driving by, a town in the car versus walking through the town versus flying over it in an airplane. Everyone is seeing the town, but, based on the mechanism of travel, that's going to transform your experience of it. So likewise, if you're thinking about a discourse in terms, it made me think a lot about, I guess, mental models. You hear a lot about, Charles Munger, different mental models. So everyone comes, the chemist may read a historical account different from the literary critic or the person who lives there, and different things like that. And it's funny how easy it is to think about subjects with not thinking about the lens through which you're thinking about the subject. It's that quick move that happens that you don't even realize that is occurring. I really loved everything he was saying on Discord. As I was reading this book, I wonder if you sometimes have this feeling where you're like, wow, I went through like 3 decades not knowing this person existed. How did that occur? Like it's a funny feeling you get when you encounter like a new thinker, a new book. You're like, I went through life not knowing this person existed. Who else do I not know exists?
But it's also reassuring that there are certain themes that keep recurring in different thinkers that are important. Like so we're now turning to the first chapter, the first essay in this collection, the burdens of history, or the burden of history. Burden of history. There's one object that you're carrying.
Yeah, it says burden right here. Good. All right here.
So what I read in his objections, his criticism of historians, professional historians of our time, or his time plus our time, resonates with me a lot with my criticism and other people's criticism of professional philosophy, professional psychology. So there are certain things that resonate. There are principles we can identify that are not exclusively associated with these problems of history, but we can begin our discussion with the problems of history and historians. Before we started recording, you were talking about the felt history that it's difficult.
No, it's one. On like how we don't really learn from history unless we feel history. But that's so problematic, because often if history, how do you feel something that you're not in? And it's curious to me, because very often it's almost like we think that if we know the facts of history, therefore we have learned history. But unless we actually feel what the people felt in that historic moment, we're probably actually not going to be prepared from the repeating pattern of history reoccurs, and if it reoccurs, because when we read about the history, we felt like nothing, or we felt objective, or we felt like it was obvious because we were reading it that way. So we're almost get the impression that if it were to reoccur, that same historical episode, we'd have those same feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And when they don't overlay, and instead maybe we feel confused or existentially uncertain, or we don't know what to believe, then we don't match up the present episode with the historic episode. And so then we don't learn from history. Like, if you don't learn to feel what they felt, I think you almost need to make a distinction, if I were to do a paper, like between historic facts and historic moments. And what we do is learning the historic facts, we think, is learning the historic moment. And it's almost like, I guess what I was saying to you, it's almost like what you need to really get history is when you open a history book, it almost needs to be like that moment at the beginning, that famous moment in Proust where he bites into the cookie and he's boom, in his childhood, he's just in it. And so, as you know, likewise, when you read a great novel, and I was mentioning reading the Red Wall series in 6th grade, it was like the first time this happened. I guess it was Mossflower, book 3 of that amazing series. All the parents out there, it's great for your kids. And then suddenly you're in the story. You're one of the mice fighting to save the abbey. You're in it. You're no longer in a blanket in the bathtub. Don't ask me why I was in a blanket in the bathtub. It's the best place to read. But I wasn't there anymore. I was now in the abbey as a mouse. And you're there. And it's almost like that's when the story really hits you, right? So likewise, it's almost like that's what needs to be what occurs when you read history, to really get it, to get the feeling, to really learn from it. And it's almost what Mr. White seems to be suggesting, is that there need to be more resources that are used, different models, different ways of doing things by historians to maybe create that moment, or that needs to be an avenue. It also made me think about, maybe this is why when we read the Iliad or some of the Greek myths, or the histories, all the different ones where they're more like stories, the Bible is kind of like a story. It's like there's some wisdom there that you really don't, we call them myths often, but they're related to histories. They're in this between space of fiction and history. Sometimes it's kind of confusing, but it's like there's almost a wisdom there that understands that if you're not put in the historical moment, and therefore don't feel it and become a character in it, then you don't learn it. And and then history will repeat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's good. I'd like to distinguish, maybe this is implicit in what you said already, but I can think of at least 2 different ways of feeling history. One of them is more fact-based. I can say, okay, I'm reading about the mice in that imagined story, fantasy, or the characters in a historical event, like Napoleonic Wars. I imagine myself to be one of those characters, and this is something that is our accomplishment. We accomplish the act of sympathizing, empathizing with characters of the past. Another sense of feeling history, or history becoming felt, is more personal, and it's a different way of connecting the present to the past. So, for example, this is more about an example of personal history. Imagine that I live in a house that used to be my father's house, let's say, and there is a little bit of like damage on one of the walls, and I don't know, it's like a mark, it's a line on a wall. And I see it every day. I don't think much of it. But one day somebody tells me, see that damage, that little damage on the wall was from a time where your father and your uncle had a physical fight. And something happened. One of them threw an object and it hit the wall. And that mark is left from that time. So now my experience of that mark on the wall is suddenly transformed into that episode. I don't need to necessarily empathize with those 2 men who had that fight, but something that I see now, something that is part of my experience now, is something is added to that. A layer of historical layer is added to that. So we can extend that to walking in museums and looking at monuments of the past, like the different museum pieces or artistic works that are carried over to our time. The more history we know, felt history, the more that history becomes felt, the more our present is connected in that sense. But this is something that Hayden White would approve of. I think this would be something that he would say historians, historiographers should try to connect, to create these traces. But he begins this essay by saying that usually this doesn't happen. And maybe we can now turn to that problem. Why history goes on, unless you have other things
Oh
to
no,
add?
I just want to comment on how much
Yeah.
I love the idea of the crack. And then there's this moment where
Crack, yes.
boom, it transforms. And
Right.
it's almost like that moment, which, you know, there are different levels of feeling, exactly right. And so the question is, how do you have a psychological feeling? One of the big problems I think you don't learn from history is precisely because it's so difficult to read history with not knowing the outcome. You know, so when you read history, you know what's going to happen. So it's very difficult to get into the mindset of not knowing what's going to happen. You know,
Right.
everyone, for example, like classically speaking, when people talk about Chamberlain and he does the peace treaty with Hitler, and we're all like, well, that was really dumb. Obviously, he was being manipulated. Well, hold on. It's really dumb now, but if you're at the time and you've got on the one hand, you think, you know, millions of London, you know, people, citizens could be killed. You got this one person, which maybe, and maybe you are rationalizing some of the aggressions as not being as bad as they obviously, maybe you're doing that, but are you really so sure a random person reading about Chamberlain that if you weren't him, you wouldn't make the same decision, right? You know, there's a certain distancing that occurs where you would never be that person. You would never do that. You would have been the right decision. And it kind of, so it becomes very difficult once you know the outcome to enter into it. It's the same that happens if you know the ending of a novel. Like when you know the ending of a novel and then you go to read it, you can still kind of get into it, but it's much more difficult because you have that sense of the outcome. And so I think one of the things that's so tricky with teaching history in order to get on, because at the end of the essay, not that you talked at the beginning, I'm talking about where he's talking about the importance of freedom. You know, these great historians where he's talking in the golden periods increases freedom with kind of the present moment and choice of different things. Well, if we go to the existentialists, so much of freedom occurs when there's an increase of, you know, existentialism, of terror, of anxiety, of uncertainty and different things. And so in order to learn history, there's almost something where the historian has to teleport you to the existential moment. And that seems to occur when somewhere in the text, it's like you're saying with the crack experience, something happens where boom, you're there. And then boom, you're feeling it. And it's similar, everything I was saying too, like, it's like when Kierkegaard talks about the problem of knowing that Isaac, you know, Abraham goes to sacrifice his son and you know, God's going to save it. So you're not in the terror of God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son. And Kierkegaard's like, dang it, no, you're missing the whole suspension of the ethical. Imagine what that would really be like, you know? And so likewise, the historian needs to be like, no, imagine what that's really like. And it makes me think, what came to mind as you were describing the crack that suddenly, boom, you know, that's the result of a fight. It reminds me of those scenes, and I love Faulkner in The Sound and the Fury, where Benji at the beginning touches a fence post and he's with Caddy. You know, he's kind of mentally, and so his logic is all associational. When he hears his family, the Compsons, have sold a field to a golf course. And so there are some people playing golf, and they say, and his sister, who's gone, was called Caddy. And so when they're saying Caddy, he's there. There's no then, you know, there's no sequence of time. He's just associated and he's in it. And so likewise, it's almost like, how can the historian make these moments where, like, Benji, you're boom, you're in it, therefore you feel it, and therefore you may learn from it. I think some of what he's saying is that it seems to me like he wants to say historians are not doing that. One, and correct me, there's a kind of idea that when you present the facts, you know, that's going to do what you need it to do. Second, he seems to be suggesting that they've forsaken artistic tools that could be useful, and that they haven't really learned from sort of they're still what did he say, that they're still operating according to sort of earlier century artistic tools that is keeping them from moving ahead.
Right. In addition to those methodological commitments, the commitments to style, there is also a kind of mindset that he sees associated with that. So he says that historians tend to be committed to that. So the burden that they identify is the commitment to past for its own sake. So the past assigns them with the duty to just go and pay attention to past facts, past events. That's it for its own sake. So professional historians. So that's the way they justify their job. Why is it that they do what they do? Because they are the ones who are committed to the past. Who else would be committed to the past, to the facts of the past, even without any actual like personal relevance or societal relevance? And what ends up happening with that mindset is history, the contingencies of history, the decisions that individuals made throughout history, they kind of become cemented and they get frozen and crystallized once we cut off the connection between the present and the past. So it becomes stories that, as you said, they were deterministic, or now we view them as deterministic. How else could they have happened? So that's I think, a constellation of things. So past for its own sake, kind of narrative illusion, and the idea that, or the impression that things couldn't have happened otherwise, and this sense of professionalism and the duty of the professional historian that doesn't need to justify itself in terms of that bridge to the present, to make it felt and make it relevant. Yeah, but that, of course, it, as you said, they all come with, these are our tools of historians. We go to archives, we're not interested in the present. We're interested in things in the past, archival records, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I find it interesting too. Like I've been thinking a lot. The wording was so perfect that you used there. The past for its own sake. I've been thinking about like art for its own sake, love for its own sake. Everything for its own sake. We talk about ends of themselves, and there's of course some truth to it. But then there's also like, what if I took a violin and I was like, no, we're just going to have the violin play for its own sake. Well, it would never be part of a symphony orchestra. It would never get paired up with other instruments. Think about the whole world of music possibility that would be cut off if you only ever played the violin for the violin's sake in concert with no other instrument. Now, there's a pitfall here where you could say, oh, well, the violin, never should be done alone. Well, then, my gosh, think of some of the most beautiful works of music you would never have that's just a violinist, a solo, right? So there's a pitfall on every side of the road. So I've increasingly wondered if there's a danger in too quickly saying that something is its own end. Like, even when you talk about, like, I love you for your own end. Well, even like someone who says like, okay, well, let's not just sit here though and you look at me and love me. Maybe we can go take a walk or something, right? Maybe there's something we can add to this. It's like, it depends on what you mean by I love you as an end of yourself. Like no one would want to be loved as an end in themselves if that just meant we sat here and did nothing. So it's kind of interesting how that language of, end of itself, because you see that and it's like, well, this is history and you should know it just because it's good to know it.
Right.
Well, it's funny too with that is because none of us, or at least me personally, you don't tend to remember anything that you don't use. It's like interesting. I worked at a wholesale for a long time with flowers. There were like hundreds and, well, arguably thousands. Well, I'll put it at like 1,000, like flower names that you had to know. I would have never done that for a test, never been able to. But when it's your job and you're using it, it's amazing. You suddenly could just boom, 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 just sort of name them all. It's just, you just do it, right? It's kind of like Heidegger talked about using a hammer. You then know how to do it. So likewise with historical, but one of the ironies is when you don't connect history to the present, well, then people don't use history and they don't remember it. But when they use it, they're like, oh, I can see. And I think also that gets tied into the fear of subjectivity. There's a fear that if people are using it to the present, they're going to corrupt the past with their own subjective interests in different things. And of course, that's a possibility. But as it seems quite clear, he's arguing that happens anyway with history, that there's a corruption where it's not owning the fact that there's an interpretational lens and then figuring out a structure by which to have those interpretational lens compete or operate against one another. And I guess around page 46, he talks about, for anyone, he talks about kind of this new way of doing history, about the governing metaphor of an historic account, treated as a heuristic rule which self-consciously eliminates certain kinds of data, et cetera. We can get into that in a moment. But he's trying to come up with a system by which to deal with these problems but you're not going to solve the problem if you think that subjectivity is escapable. And if you do entirely escape subjectivity, then you're going to get rid of the reason to care about it. Because in subjectivity is emotion and relation and different things like that. So it seems like he's trying to avoid that mistake.
So to return to that, something for its own sake, history for its own sake, art for its own sake, that sentiment is expressed sometimes as a way of refusing a kind of responsibility. And I think we would agree that it shouldn't be for that reason. That's like, no, I say no to that responsibility. I only want this particular kind of responsibility. But when we say something for its own sake, we could also, alternatively, we could say, in addition to all those responsibilities, I also want to be responsible to this thing for its own sake too. Like loving somebody for their own sake is like, okay, in addition to all those other things that you're connected with, I'm also committed to for your own sake, for you as an end in yourself, as opposed to I'm refusing all those other responsibilities.
Yeah, and arguably without that, the other things wouldn't have anything to hang on. So it can certainly play a central role. I love how you're putting that. It's almost like colors of a rainbow. If it was all red, it wouldn't be very good, but also it needs all the different parts or the, all the different colors. So yes, absolutely, that it's in concert with, symphony orchestra with everything else.
So maybe we can connect that to something he writes about when he's talking about the golden age of history, the golden age, the first half of the 19th century. Let me see if I can find it.
Was that on 49? He starts talking about Hegel, Balzac, and Tocqueville, I believe,
right.
49, 50.
Right.
Yeah.
The exponents of realistic historicism, Hegel, Balzac, and Tocqueville, to take representatives from philosophy, the novel, and historiography, respectively, agreed that the task of the historian was less to remind men of their obligation to the past than to force upon them an awareness of how the past could be used to effect an ethically responsible transition from the present to future. So it's the idea is that we bring to life that openness of the past. Similarly, like another book that we both like, Finite and Infinite Games. For the players of the infinite game, the past is not finished. That's a key insight. I think Hayden White is trying to express that sentiment as well. The past is not finished, and by going back to the past, by revisiting history, we realize that how open those moments were in the past, and how individuals made decisions, and how in a similar way the present moment is open to making decisions, and how our role can be brought to life and become more visible to us, that we can make decisions in connecting the present to future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it made me think, like, if I were to ask, is a novel ever finished? Well, there's a sense in which it is. Yeah, you get to the last page and it's done. But, if I think, is the Brothers Karamazov ever finished with me? Is The Remains of the Day ever finished with me? I start Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse, et cetera, and so forth. Not really. No, they're never finished with you. You're still rethinking them. Suddenly you say, oh, it's like Ivan Karamazov. Like, you're seeing it. It's like it's never finished with you. And I couldn't help but, as reading this, say, think about history. And also, too, it reminds me a lot of Hans Gadamer in Truth and Method, where he's talking about the only way to really get history is through art, because you don't encounter the full horizon of that moment. And it's almost like you need to make a distinction between historic facts and historic moments, where unfortunately we tend to believe that if we know the historic facts, we also get the historic moment, when we don't necessarily, and therefore history, we don't really learn from history, and et cetera, so forth. But it's like a novel's never finished with you, really. And history shouldn't be either. Faulkner had that great line where he said, the past isn't over, the past isn't even past, it's still there. And he's saying that in the context of this kind of Compson family, where they're always in the past of Caddy being gone, and this vision of Caddy up in the tree, and it's always there. So likewise, history, when it really works, if you will, when it really hits you, then it's never finished with you. You're always thinking about that historic moment in light. And then, but I think he's so astute, though, by noting that if you have a deterministic vision of history, there's nothing to learn. What are you going to do? Okay, well, let's say you learn X. Well, if it's determined, you can't do anything with X. It's not like you could use X and change the course of the future or anything. And so that reading of history, therefore, simultaneously renders learning history, I don't even know what you're doing at that point. I guess you're collecting glass beads or something.
In fact, it's not that it has no effect. It actually has a negative effect. He brings in Nietzsche and his criticism of the misuses of history, that it encourages us to be passive. Again, a psychological parallel to that, and psychological analogy is like, I'm feeling very unhappy with my life, and then somebody gives me a root of my psychological explanation of how my childhood determined my current unhappiness. And it was determined, and it is determined, and it couldn't be otherwise. And then my response to that would be, oh, okay, so I just accept it. I just accept the state of affairs. I think that's why he opens this chapter, this essay, by saying that history tends to be the conservative discipline par excellence. That view, that way of handling history and historical facts as determined, as insights that allow us to accept the present condition, just keeps things as they are. So That's I think passivity is one outcome, a negative outcome.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I think also our views on, say, free will, determinism, all of that are so rigid, so I call it monotheorist, a single theory by which to explain theory, monotheorist. The likelihood that I can radically transform my possibilities tomorrow, like literally in 10 hours, is significantly less than the possibility of me radically transforming my possibilities in a month. So it's like, how it becomes easier to predict where the hurricane's going the closer it gets to the shore, right? The further out, it's harder to say. So likewise, it seems to be something like that involving freedom, like in determinism. And it seems like it's more like directionism. Like there are things we can control, certain things we cannot control, and it sets a direction. But if I said you're directed, that's much softer than determined. And I think something like you're directed is closer, because yes, I literally am somewhat bound in what I can do within the next 10 hours. I can, because like, for example, let's say I want to be a world-class ski diver or something, right? It's literally impossible for me to develop the skills within 10 hours, but it probably is not impossible over 10 years, right? So, the horizon of possibility, I keep using the word horizon today. I guess I've gotten drunk on Gadamer. Horizon of possibility transforms relative to the distance of it. And that's something I think is important for history, where you say, okay, well, sure, once, if you're talking simple, once Jefferson Davis, announces succession in the South, there is probably a certain line of it. There's a certain bracketing of what can happen next, right? But before that event, or before Abraham Lincoln is the South, or before Pearl Harbor, there's probably a different bracket of events that can occur. So I think it's important to realize that the relation between freedom and direction is symbiotic. It's transforming and it's shifting, and it's relative to range. And it's just interesting to me that the conversation, I know it's an entirely different philosophical topic. It's just interesting to me that conversation is so, what's the word? Stagnant, so rigid. It's not very dynamic. It's not time framed. It's not moving relative to how much time over how many choices, the nature of the choice. It always is an interesting conversation. And I think he's completely correct that many historians have, or at least at the time he was writing. I mean, a lot of people today are very determinist. I mean, arguably quantum mechanics and different interpretations of quantum mechanics. I'm no scientist, but that has opened up a new conversation on the role due to indeterminacy on freedom. Now, there's a lot of people that say that's a popular understanding, and that's not true, that the indeterminacy is simply a matter of measurement, not the actual ontological substance itself, if you will, but that's an entirely different. I find that quite interesting. I had a guy work at CERN kind of slap me around. He's like, no, indeterminacy is just the measurement problem. We don't know anything about the quantums themselves. And I was like, oh, guys, I'm sorry. But anyway, it still works as a metaphor. And so likewise, it seems to have opened up freedom. But there definitely was a period of time where determinism was dominant in people's thinking. And it's interesting because I guess it is, to me at least, so obvious how passive that makes you. And then what are you studying? Like, I'm not even sure what you're studying at that point. You're just studying a collection of facts. Why not just go? To me, at that point, this sounds really crude, I suppose. At that point, if history is determined, then you might as well just go count how many grass blades you have in the yard. It's just any facts, any amount of information. Why not? There is no difference in significance of the type of facts that you're collecting. You might as well just count how many grades of grass are in the yard, right? You might as well count the trees. You might as well just collect random lists of data, because there is no difference in the weight of the facts if determinism is the case.
Right. So by going and selecting historical narratives, they are kind of falling into a performative contradiction, because they are revealing that they want to constrain the scope of history. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
That's really good. So you're saying that the very fact that they choose to discuss this history, but then simultaneously talk about it determined, is paradoxical, because there's no reason to pick that significant episode by the own logic of your philosophy.
Right.
Oh, that's beautiful. Wow, I'm gonna write that down. That's great, Davood.
Thank you. And regarding the freedom, free will versus determinism, it is, I agree, it is a little bit unfortunate, but it's a habit of thought for us. I think we tend to, rather than thinking in terms of dialectics and mutual forming of two forces, we tend to think about, okay, it's most easy, the metaphor of opposite forces, like freedom on the one hand or determinism on the other hand, and taking sides. Which one is the right one? Which one is the one that is illusory? But I think this is embodied very well in, sorry about my cats.
It's a cat.
Talking. Yeah.
Oh, you've been writing on her Murakami lately, and Kafka, is it Kafka in the story where he has the cat village or something like that? That's beautiful. Good man.
I haven't
Well
read
done,
that
sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got in a big debate though between Ishiguro and Murakami. Murakami never ties the Watchbird Chronicle. He doesn't wind up bird. I'm sorry. He doesn't tie his novels together. The stories don't tie together. It's like beautiful. There's that scene in the Watchbird where he picks the grass and it blows. It's like, wow, this is physical. It's like a Miyazaki film. And then there are ducks. There was ducks at the end. I have no idea why there are ducks at the end. But at least when I get to, Stevens over in Remains of the Day is like heart-wrenching. He's talking about banter at the end. Yeah, I agree with you. I have trouble with Murakami because I have no idea why there are whales flying in the sky all of a sudden. It just happens. Wow. I guess it's magical. So anyway, but that's just my view. But you were trying to say something and your cat made me think about Murakami.
Yeah, no problem. I was trying to say that this mutuality between constraints and freedom is embodied very well in your method of you teach how people should play the piano. That way of relating to constraints and at the same time the freedom to play. The freedom to play always happens and needs a constraint, a kind of structure within which it can make decisions. And I think this is Anyways.
And I'm a huge believer that when it comes to the piano, it's so funny you brought it up, that we like to teach songs and then improvisation, but actually you should teach improvisation and then songs, because on improvisation, there's no standard of failure. And then you feel like you're okay. But when you have a song that you want to learn when you start, well, there's a standard of failure and you go to the key and you hear immediately. So you never build the confidence. That's the problem. But when you start with improvisation, you're like, hey, I sound pretty good on the piano. Now you have the confidence where you can introduce a standard of failure and it's okay. You don't give up because everyone you pretty much give up on anything you lose confidence in. And so it's because it's, so likewise, but the key is to improv. It's like, well, if you stay in this L here, we say, locate, lock, and liberate. If you stay in this L and you don't go out of this L, whatever you play is going to sound good. And then you can tinker. So now you have a map by which you can play and you can go. And similarly too, if people are not led to believe that history can relate to now, then there are no patterns. And if there are no patterns, there's no heuristic of organization by which to go through historical information to determine what you should care about, what you should not care about, and thus determine, how you can relate it today. So you can't locate anything. You certainly can't be liberated in whatever you find. And so then no one studies history. And then the historians are upset because nobody's reading history. Well, guys, you just told us that it's deterministic. Two, you're not saying you're not giving us any sense that there are patterns that relate to us today by which we could use as a heuristic to go through the past. So we're not going to write history. We might as well go count blades of grass in the yard. And so no, it's exactly right. And well, it's almost to where maybe there's also an incentive to say it's determined. I'm just curious about, I guess maybe it's just the zeitgeist. Maybe there's an incentive to say it's determined because then you're trying to bracket out interpretation. Like you're saying it's determined, therefore it's objective, therefore it can't be interpreted, therefore I don't care what you have to say. Like there's some sort of capture of the authority in that move. I feel that might be there. But and that's why I guess White is getting accused of being some sort of relativist. But correct me if, because he sounds like that's what he said, but correct me if I'm wrong with this. It's almost like what he wants to say. So if I were to say, can you do anything when you're writing a novel? Like are you literally free to do anything you want in the story? The good novelist knows that's not true. You kind of are, but you can't. But if you do anything you want to do, it's deus ex machina, right? You can't just have a character suddenly fly. There are actually rules to a fiction novel. It doesn't seem like it because it's imagined, but there actually are rules. So it's almost like he wants to say, it's like, okay, every historical account is somehow kind of like a novel construction. I don't want to say it's a fiction, it's a historic novel that therefore has certain rules that it has to follow. And it's not the case that anything goes because it has to maintain the internal consistency of that system. And you make your model of, say, the American Revolution. You'll make your model of the American Revolution. Maybe you emphasize the Tories. Maybe you emphasize George Washington. Maybe it's something like 20 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And maybe, that Wallace Stevens poem. And maybe it's something too. It's like you can't literally get at a historic moment unless you have 20 ways of looking at it per se. But that makes it sound relativistic. But he was saying, no. Every way is per se a novel about the same subject that has to maintain certain rules, and then you can put them in a dialectical discussion with one another.
Exactly.
And that's how you'll get at the event. That's how I kind of took what he was saying.
That's right. I think I got the same interpretation of his view, that we need the plurality of perspectives. We need a plurality of biases and concerns. Of course, the objection, he considers the objection that, if the present is connected to the past in our study of the history, our present is entangled with our concerns and our biases and the things that we want, our preferences, and that colors our view of history, our view of the past. But since we can do this study differently, and your study will be different from my study, since we have different concerns, different emphases, different ways of paying attention, together we will achieve a kind of balance, or remove our dialectical relationship, the way in which we correct each other, we raise objections to each other's studies of history. So this is the part of the burden of history, is to be mindful of the possibility of doing things differently, because that objective, lawful study of history that is based on determinism, that gives the historian that kind of special authority, that aura, as you pointed out, the aura of objectivity, the aura of somebody, a historian scientist. But since that cannot be achieved, then we have to embrace the community. That the burden is to do this in a way that is mindful of the community of historians and the plurality of perspectives within that.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the keys is if you get out of your head that a novel is quote unquote a fiction where anything goes. All right, that there actually is an internal consistency that has to be maintained. There are rules that have to be maintained. And if we think of a historical account as a novel, we'll say the historian is in a sense making a novel that is as true as to the events as possible. Well, then that's a way of going, okay, it's not objective, but it's also not therefore wrong. And it's almost like the burden of history too is the very fact that you can't get an objective account, because, oh man, how much easier would it be if you could, right? Once we get the right account, we're done. There's no more work. But literally, it is possible that we don't have the right account of any historical moment in history. That is a theoretical possibility if objectivity is not possible. And there's something existentially burdensome about knowing that. And there's something existentially unnerving about the fact that you always have to be in a dialectical tension. We don't like tension. The brain hates tension. It wants to save energy and watch some Netflix. And you're telling me that there is not one book I can go read about the American Revolution and be done. You're telling me that I have to go make a dialectical, read 20 and maintain some sort of tension in myself, which means I have to trust the authority of all those people. And how do I know I can trust those people? And how do I even know they're getting the facts right? I just want to watch some Netflix, but I also don't want to be uninformed because my 5th grade teacher told me it's bad to be uninformed. But and you see today so much, even not to bring in the COVID situation, but there's so much of the COVID right now shows you that Habermasian legitimization crisis, where nobody knows who to trust and institutions don't have legitimacy and different things. We're right there. How do I trust what historical account? And it's if history could be objective, it would all be taken care of. We wouldn't have to worry about all these things. So there is an existential incentive to do it. But Parrot, on the flip side, dialectical tension seems to be what's good for us. They always say that a shark, if it stops swimming, dies. So likewise, once we become sort of stagnant and stable on a set understanding, that seems to be bad for us, because then we form tribes. Then we become very totalitarian in our thinking. We become very simplistic in our thinking. And I think a lot of, if we're thinking like Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism, there's almost this idea of thinking becomes very pigeonholed in certain groups. And then people live an everyday life that reaffirms that way of thinking. And it never even occurs to them that they're participating in a certain bigotry or whatever, because it's as everyday as the landscape. Always think the banality of evil. So it's like the everydayness of evil. It's it becomes part, but that's a different subject. I talk about belonging. But anyway, there's something about the brain, I guess, because it's funny, why did history go in this objective direction? One is the authority, but two, there's an existential dimension of what you have to accept if you have to maintain a dialectical tension, because you have to read a lot of different novels. Because what you were describing about having a plurality, well, that means I have to read a bunch of books about a given historic subject, not one. And I have to also read a bunch of books by a bunch of different authors about a bunch of different things.
Right.
Oh
right.
man, Davood, you're what? Yeah, I mean, come on, man. You're talking about reading a book a week. Oh, gosh, I thought if I read a book a year, I was doing better than the average American. You're talking about a book a week? There's a lot of that there.
So that reveals that our mental models, the mental models that we operate with, we tend to operate with about efforts, how effort is supposed to be translated into something else. So I think the common model that we operate with, most people are familiar with, is that if I put effort into doing something, then that has to be translated into me becoming some kind of authority. And at the same time, becoming more and more confident in the things that I've read about. So confidence and authority, and we need to question that model, the model that's the main process, that's the journey. More effort means more authority, more, and people some of the current public intellectuals unfortunately reinforce that model because they tell that story about themselves and how I read about this for many years, and then now listen to me, I'm the authority now. And one of the reasons I really enjoy your writing and your project on YouTube and on your writings is that you are, I could summarize the motive behind your work as like going against this tendency, going against this unitary, overconfident, and which leads to antagonistic relationships exclusively between perspectives. So yeah, unfortunately, I lost my train of thought. But this model,
that was really very kind of you to say that about the writing. And two, the thing you're saying about certainty is critical, because we actually think that the presence of certainty is evidence of the presence of truth, when it's actually usually the complete opposite, because the world is dynamic, the world is changing, it's composed of a ton of variables. The presence of certainty is more likely evidence of the presence of ideology as opposed to the presence of quote unquote truth, because ideology is in the business of making you feel certain. Now, here's the other problem. Another reason I think we've fallen into that trap is because we think that if we can't have certainty, then all we can have is epistemic nihilism, right? It's like two extremes. Well, no, just because you can't have certainty doesn't mean you can't have confidence. I don't know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but I am confident the sun is going to rise tomorrow. And it's based on experience and knowledge about how physics works and so forth and so on. So there's a middle ground called confidence. And you see, the thing is, even if we cannot have certainty about a historic event by creating a dialectic between different internally consistent models of history that we will call history novels per se, that then collide with one another, it is possible from that to get a confident interpretation of a historic event. But just the very fact that it's confident, though, then means there's a little bit of space that means you always have to look again. You always have to be thinking again. One of my favorite quotes, I guess it's Leopold Hand, and Jonathan Rauch uses it all the time, and I love it, and I use it all the time. And it says that the spirit, liberty is found in that spirit that's not too sure of itself. Liberty is found in that spirit that's not too sure of itself. And that's not exactly right, but it's this idea that when you're super sure, there's no longer freedom. And, if you think about it, it's true, right? Because what is certain? Something that doesn't move. What is certain? Something that doesn't move. Well, what is that? It's something that's not free. If it can't move, it can't be free. And so likewise, we need to get out of our head that certainty is a sign of the presence of truth, because it's more so the presence of ideology. And then with that, not think that therefore we can't have confidence, where we then become an epistemic nihilist because then if you become an epistemic nihilist, well, why learn anything? It doesn't matter, right? So you can fall. So certainty can get you. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about certainty that's so bad is once I get certainty, all new information is a threat. Like once I am certain that X is true, what in the world could I possibly gain by reading anything else about X?
Yeah.
There's only risk. There's only downside. So once I get certainty, new information only has downside, okay? Right. And so then you get in this little bubble and, you watch your news stations and So, the mistake of
certainty has to be protected. Yeah.
Certainty has to be protected. Certainty is fragile. We think certainty is strong and robust, but no, it is fragile. Yeah. Confidence is anti-fragile, use that Nassim Taleb language. And also too, confidence is where you do have the capability to learn, but you can never ever be so sure in what you learn that you can then impose it on others. or that you can use it forcefully, that you
Right.
can have it as a force that you can use on other people. So certainty has destroyed politics. I mean, it's destroyed history, historical accounts, we follow this. Certainty has also destroyed our own ability to think, because we're after a goal. Because the other thing that happens, if you read a book and you don't believe you understand it until you're certain, well, then you're like, we'll always be reading it and you'll never go anywhere and you'll never make any progress because you feel like you're doing it wrong. So you also can't have growth as well. So I think it is really, really important to change the barometer to confidence. And then also too, lastly, if the goal is to get confidence about an understanding of a historic account, well, then I can move on from it, because I can never get certainty. So I know that's not a goal I can ever get, but I can get to the point where I say, well, I have a pretty good idea of what happened in the American Revolution, or what happened in the 1920s that led to the financial crisis. I don't know for sure, and I'm always open to a new book, but I'm pretty confident I understand it, and therefore I have the confidence needed to see patterns in the present. I now have confidence to which I can confidently see the president in light of the past, but not so sure about it that I can make some sort of absolute statement that then oppresses other people. Where I say, well, what the Federal Reserve is saying is exactly the same as 1929 or the 1970 oil crisis. Okay, you're fair. You're confident to have patterns, but you also can't be certain that the whole stock market's going to collapse tomorrow or something right there. So also confidence is, I think, going to help bridge the present in the past, where certainty keeps them separate.
Right. That's very useful to distinguish between certainty and confidence. Yeah, I think I'm going to use that. I'm going to adopt that difference. Yeah. And confidence is necessary. I think it's necessary, because let's say you and I disagree over something, and if one of us is not confident, then that dialectical relationship cannot take place. We both need our fuel, and we need to spend our fuel in order to give rise to that dialectical relationship. And the fuel that runs out first, so to speak, to stretch a metaphor, would probably indicate that that confidence was relatively less grounded. Yeah. So I think that's a good point to stop this session. We are almost at the 1 hour mark.
Well, this was great. Fun. I've enjoyed it so much, Davood.
I encourage everybody to go and check out. I provide links to your work in the description of this video, and we will discuss, after I pause the recording. But thank you, everybody who joined us.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a delight.